NEO-AFRO Audio presents COVID-98 Part 1, written by Kofi Ose-Uwosu, narrated by Joyce Licorice. COVID-98 Part 1. The beat in his headphones came in hot. There it was. The bass vibrated against his head, but it felt good. It felt good, but he felt guilty. The news had gotten to him, which was why he tried to ignore it on a daily basis. It wasn't that he wanted to blissfully go through life ignorant of what was happening. It was the myriad of emotions that accompanied the pictures, the videos, and it just made him upset. Delante drained the soda can, then shook it to check if there was any left. Satisfied it was empty, he walked through the crowded house with bodies gyrating to some old-school classics. Snoop. None of that crap they had coming out now. He couldn't get with it. The message was lost. The message that music artists talked about back in the day. Change, hope, community. Julie spotted him, slipping through the dancing forms toward the kitchen. Delante was cute when he was in that mode, zoned out and oblivious to the world around him. A year before they started dating, he never seemed to notice that she would watch him sometimes, but she would catch him watching her. Every ball game, she would sit with her friends, and he would sit off by himself, leaned back against the stands with his arms outstretched as if he were catching rays of the sun rather than cheering on their team. She would catch him looking at her a lot. "Girl, don't do it," her friends would say. "He's a player, and he's a jerk." Julie wasn't sure about either of those things, and she had dated a player and a jerk before, in Anton. God, Anton. That was a mistake. Delante opened the kitchen door and immediately found what he was looking for, the black trash bag that his cousin had placed there. He opened the bag and threw the can in when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Didn't you know it was Earth Day today? Don't you guys recycle?" Julie. Delante turned around to make sure she saw him roll his eyes. She put her hands on her hips and scoffed. "What's with the attitude? Saving the planet is important. We should all do our part." Delante bowed and shook his head. "No attitude. I'm just curious. How's that my smart, attractive black girlfriend is still coming at me about saving the earth? The way things are going these days, you need to get your priorities straight." Delante scolded and then shrugged as if he were done with his lecture. Julie narrowed her eyes and tilted her head. "What do you mean by that?" Delante laughed. "Do I really need to spell it out?" Julie's hands went from her hips to across her chest as she popped her hip out. "Please do. Please tell me what's more important than saving the earth from an ecological disaster," she responded. "Babe, come on. Have you seen what it's like out there? Maybe before you start going on about saving the earth, you should think about saving your own people. You could be concerned about reparations and the fact that black lives don't matter. I'm tired of black men and women being killed in the streets every day. Poverty in our communities, drugs taking over our communities because of the poverty, and white fragility making sure that even when we rise up beyond our oppressors, educate ourselves, and achieve all the accolades society have, we are still treated like second-class citizens." He felt his voice rising and forced himself to stop before he really started to lose it. Julie raised her eyebrow, but came with a softer voice. "Why are you all of a sudden hating white people, Delante? You were adopted by white folks." "I never said I hate white people," he clarified. "I hate the system that's been put in place to make them feel superior to us." Julie nodded slowly and sighed, walking up to him and giving him a hug. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to argue with you. It was stupid of me to make the comment I made. It's my fault." "It wasn't that," Delante said. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to flip out like that. I've just been getting so angry lately with black people saying that we need to save the earth when we can't fix it that way. The main culprits are the multinationals producing this packaging that can't be recycled efficiently and non-biodegradable products. As black people, we have so far to go, and sometimes I feel so frustrated with us." "I'm seriously impressed right now. You actually know your stuff about the planet." Delante blushed a little, I didn't say it wasn't important, and I do listen to you when you talk about it. But as black people, we have more immediate concerns. I didn't know you felt so strongly about the subject. It never really comes up when we're together, and just so you know that I am with you on this. I support blacks raising up black culture. You know, we can talk about this anytime. Yeah, I used to only talk to Janice about this. Janice was his adopted mom. Though she didn't like to be called Mom, she was Janice. And she raised him to know that while she took care of him and loved him, she would never want him to forget his culture. And that's how she was about everything. She dragged him to every protest, pro-choice march, demonstration against big corporate companies, and more. She had a voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it. She's a bit of a badass. I remember you telling me, Julie agreed. She encouraged me to stand up for what I believed in and fight for what I thought was right. Julie rubbed his head. You really care about her? Yeah, I do. She's crazy, but awesome at the same time. He looked down at his phone and cursed under his breath. Damn, I forgot I have to study for the physics test tomorrow. I need to get out of here. Julie pouted. So soon? But the night is still young and we haven't made fun of any drunk people yet. I know, but if I fail this test, then I'm really going to be in trouble. She sighed. Well, do you want me to come with you and help you study? He shook his head. I just want you to have a good time, and then tomorrow when I pass, we can, celebrate. He smiled, and she laughed. Oh, I see you want to celebrate. Well, I hope you have something good planned for this celebration. Oh, I will. He started to back away. She winked at him, and then quickly pointed in his direction. Be safe, boy, promise me. I'll see you tomorrow. He waved her off. He could tell that he got her mind on cultural events surrounding black people, and there was a fresh worry in her eyes. I promise, he said. As Delante left the party, he was still smiling. He couldn't help it. He had liked her for so long. When they first met, she had been coming to his cousin's weekly tailgate to watch them play, but he always found himself focusing more on her than the game. He thought she was out of his league. She had been dating that one guy. He was stupid, but he was also big. Delante wasn't about to get his butt kicked by trying to talk to her. Now they had been dating for a year, and he couldn't be happier with anyone else. He just hadn't felt right about really speaking his truth. He slowly revealed things about himself, where she was pretty much an open book. Something about his mindset today made him release his thoughts. No one wanted to hear the truth, or at least hear about how much it mattered. They were just fine with the hashtags and the posts on social media. Julie was different. She drew things out of him. A distant siren and screaming pulled his attention from his thoughts. A dog barked at him from behind a window as he passed the house. About a block ahead was Marcus, the neighborhood goon. He was sitting on a stoop with his 3 stooges. Delante swallowed hard and looked for a way to avoid the boys. He never had any real beef with them, but they always managed to find a way to make his day suck. He glanced at his shoes. Plus, he just copped the latest Jordans, and there was a good chance they'd try to jack him. As he continued down the sidewalk, he noticed an alley on his right. Swallowing hard, he took it as inconspicuous as he could. Plastic trash bins overflowing with black trash bags lined the brick walls of the alley, and the squeak of a rat made him cringe. He checked over his shoulder ever so often to see if Marcus or his goons had noticed him, but after a few minutes, he sighed in relief. The sound of screeching tires reached him just as the alley came to an end. He exited the alley and turned left onto a street he'd never been on. Instantly, the harsh blue and white lights of police cruisers forced him to squint. The cars were still a little ways off, and as he walked, he started to take in the scene as it unfolded. 3 cop cars had blocked off the street. Though since it was a residential street, there probably wouldn't have been any cars rolling through at night anyway. There were 4 cops in all, and 3 of them were shouting. All 4 were white. The glint of gunmetal in the moonlight made his heart erupt into a flurry of beats, and he paused, questioning if he should turn back. A morbid curiosity pressed him forward, and he gulped as he tried to remain invisible. The 3 cops that were shouting were the same cops that had their guns drawn. 10 kids, some of whom were his neighbors, were standing in front of the cops with their hands up. One of the kids was asking them not to shoot. The one officer without his gun drawn was resting against one of the squad cars with his arms folded. Delonte reached toward his pocket to grab his phone. As he pulled it out, the full moon shimmered against the sleek case and caught the attention of the relaxing cop. The officer glared at him, and Delonte froze, even before the officer yelled, "Freeze!" Delonte swallowed hard again as the officer reached his left hand up to his shoulder radio. His right hand settled onto the strap covering his service pistol. Delonte fought every fiber of his being that screamed for him to run. He figured acting rash and running without provocation would be bad. "Dispatch, add another dark one to the roster. We need that transport van after all. Stand by." As the officer started to unstrap his weapon, the past few years flashed by Delonte's mind's eye. In a split second, he thought of his cousin, who had been killed by Marcus' brother over talking to a girl. He thought of his nephew, who had been hit by a stray bullet while playing outside with his toys. He thought of his Uncle Sam, who had been put in the pen for 25 years after a group of cops planted evidence on him. He thought of his Uncle Gerard, who had overdosed in the street while a crowd of white people just watched and recorded the incident on their phones instead of calling for help. He thought of what his adopted white parents would think when they got the call about him either being in jail or dead. The click of the cop switching the safety off on his service pistol snapped Delonte back to the present. His eyes widened, and he could see it in the pig's eyes that he had nothing but hate for Delonte and everything Delonte represented. Before Delonte knew it, he was running. Adrenaline fueled his every step, and his ears started to pound as his heart thumped faster and faster. He had neglected to check for an escape route before running, but thankfully there was another alley to his right. The walls echoed his footsteps and the shouts of the pig as they squealed for him to stop. Jumping over a full trash can, he knocked it over before continuing. The alley ended and opened up into a long, forgotten warehouse district littered with boarded-up buildings. Addicts and the homeless relaxed on the sidewalk and the few patches of grass, but Delonte ignored them. The cop exited the alley a few moments behind Delonte, still yelling for him to stop. Turning on a street with a sign that had been bent in half, Delonte found the nearest warehouse and went around the side. Out of breath and in a panic, he ran down the entire length of the warehouse before stopping to take a quick breather. The cop appeared at the other end of the warehouse and pointed his weapon again. Delonte cursed under his breath and ran around behind the building. A small window was just above the cement ground, and he kicked it in, hoping he didn't scuff his new shoes too badly. After clearing out the shards still stuck to the window pane with a rusty pipe he picked up off the ground, he dropped to the ground and eased inside. There was a slight drop to a large scaffold that ran the entire length of the wall, and Delonte landed on his back with a grunt. The scaffold was 15 feet above the basement floor. The crack of broken glass steeled Delonte's muscles, and he hopped to his feet in an instant. He checked over his shoulder and saw the cop back in, feet first. Still looking over his shoulder, Delonte rammed into a wall, and the wind was knocked from his lungs. He gasped and turned left, almost falling down the first step on a set of thin wooden steps that descended from the scaffold and into the basement. There was no guardrail to aid his descent, and he almost fell a few times trying to catch his breath. The wood creaked beneath his weight, and the nails holding the wooden staircase to the cement wall started to loosen. Hopping down the remaining steps just as the cop made it to the top of the stairs, Delonte shot forward into the darkness. He bumped into something hard and dropped to the ground. Barely able to see and unsure of what else to do, he scooted up against whatever he had tripped over and tried to quiet his breathing. His heart continued to thump in the back of his throat. "That's a negative, dispatch," came the voice of the cop, echoing in the dark basement. "Lost him to the shadows. Go ahead and send the van still, though." Then, after a tiny response from the radio, the cop said to himself, "I'm not breaking my neck on these stupid streets for no kid." Let 'em rot down here." Delante waited a full 10 minutes after he heard the last of the cop's shoes echo in the dark room before he stood. His eyes had adjusted to the darkness by now, aided by the gray of the moon as it filtered in through the windows that surrounded the top of the basement. The room he was in appeared to be a storage basement, and there were discarded items strewn in every direction. It was a miracle that he hadn't tripped over something sharp and hurt himself. The thing he had tripped over was the size and shape of a car and was covered by a tin tarp. It was the only thing free of dust. He examined some of the shelves and found a number of sorted beakers and jars, some of which were broken. Hundreds of feet of wire, stacks of paper, tons of folders, and a countless assortment of tools were littered throughout the room, but most of the tools appeared broken or worthless. Delante opened up one of the folders and tried to read the notes that had been scribbled across the papers, but it might as well have been Swahili. "Maybe this'll at least be a cool car," Delante said just above a whisper as he yanked back the tarp. The tarp slid to the floor, and Delante blinked a few times in shock. A low hum that he had failed to detect before was emanating from the machine before him, but it was nothing he had ever seen before. Though it was about the same size as a coupe, there were no wheels, there were no windows or mirrors. It was more cylindrical than a car would be, but the thing that had frozen him in place was the fact that the car appeared to levitate 20 centimeters above the floor, all on its own. What appeared to be a single door was on the side, and he stared at it for a long time before his curiosity got the better of him. Pulling on the handle activated the door's opening mechanism, and it popped out a few centimeters before sliding to the side with a low hiss and whir. "What's the worst that could happen?" Delante said with a grin, still just above a whisper. Scooting into the machine activated the lights, and a touchscreen display appeared in front of him. The interior smelled like new shoes. None of the buttons on the touchscreen were labeled. He pushed one of the buttons, and the door closed. Inside it was pitch black, save for the illumination provided by the touchscreen, and he started to panic, fantasizing that he would be locked in the car forever. After pushing the same button again failed to open the door, he started pushing random buttons. Each button push registered with a soft click, and then what sounded like an engine started, and the whole machine began to rumble. The display winked out, and he gasped, startled. "No, no, no," he said, touching the area where the screen had once been. "Come back! How do you open the door?" The rumbling turned into a quake that was violent enough to hurt his butt. He started to bang on where the touchscreen had been, but nothing but hollow clacks echoed back. The vibrations the machine made continued intensifying until his head hurt. A sound very similar to an approaching airplane started in front of him, and as it grew, he started to feel dizzy. "Wait! No! Whatever you're doing!" Delante started, but he lost consciousness before he could finish his sentence. "Beep, beep, beep." Delante groaned at the sound of the low-pitched beeping and opened his eyes. He wiped the corner of his mouth as if he had been drooling, and when he remembered the last thing that had happened, he jumped up and bumped his head on the top of the machine. What happened?" he said, the throbbing in his head coming from something other than the recent bump on the ceiling. His nose was running, and when he wiped it, he realized it was bleeding a little. He sniffled and used his shirt to wipe away the blood, groaning at the thought of ruining his shirt. His legs had fallen asleep, and as he moved them, pins and needles walked up his whole lower half. He stretched out his left leg a few times, and his knee cracked as if he had been sitting down for a long time. He stretched his right leg, and as he did, the hiss of the door decompressing and sliding back startled him. Sunlight filtered in, and he squinted his eyes. He scooted out the machine, expecting his feet to land on the harsh cement floor of the warehouse basement, but instead the soft yield of dirt is all he felt. The sound of distant birds tweeting pleasant songs reached his ears, and he realized the entire warehouse was gone, replaced by a field on the outskirts of a city. An assortment of aromatic flowers were all around him, and a few honeybees and flies buzzed about, but he ignored them, stunned with the city in front of him. "Well, I ain't in Kansas anymore," Delante said, glancing back at the machine. "Where in the world did you take me?" He turned to the machine and looked inside, hoping to find a map of his location or any clue as to where he had been transported, but nothing registered. Instead, a slight jolt of electricity zapped his hand, and he pulled back. A few seconds later, the machine door recompressed with a whir and a hiss. Moments after the door shut, the exterior paint shuddered like a glitch on a computer monitor before vanishing. "What the?" Delante started as a wave of distress rippled through his chest. He patted the air where the machine was supposed to be and sighed in relief, happy the vehicle was just camouflaged. Turning back to the city a mile or so in the distance, he whistled and shrugged. Then he remembered maybe his phone had a signal. He pulled out his phone to see. There wasn't even one bar. Disappointed, he groaned. "Well, may as well capture this because no one will believe me if I ever get back." He selected camera mode and shot some frames of the city ahead. Lacking any other options or ideas, he headed toward it with circumspection. The whole city appeared to be composed of a series of white cones and spherical structures. After a few minutes of walking, he neared, close enough to realize that the buildings were also haloed in what reminded him of a Hyperloop train. But instead of trains circling the tracks, there were individual people hooked up to some sort of harness that kept them attached to thin tracks. The tracks wove around every building and every area of the city he could see. When he entered the city, he was nearly knocked over by someone disengaging from the track. They stumbled and fell in an effort to dodge him, and he held up his hands. "By Prophet Mandela!" the person cried. They found their bearings and glared at Delante. The first thing he noticed was their clothing. They were donned in an all-white jacket with white buttons. A silver sash was wrapped around their waist, and their shoes were as white as if they'd never walked on them before. If they backed up to one of the buildings, they would disappear. "What in the Prophet's name are you wearing?" the person said with a scoff. Delante looked at his clothes and realized how out of place in this world of white his light blue shirt must have looked. The person in front of him was at least a person of color, but the way they talked sounded so foreign to him. They spoke English well enough, but something about their enunciation made him feel like they grew up in a different century from him. The person slowly shook their head in disgust and walked inside the nearest building. Delante realized the whole ordeal had made him hold his breath, and he exhaled. He looked around. Every building looked like it had been power washed, and the streets looked clean enough to eat off of. He scratched his head. He wasn't used to this type of cleanliness. The streets he was used to smelled like sewage on its best day. Maybe the machine had taken him to Rwanda. Delante knew nothing about Rwanda, but it sounded like it looked like this. Flashing lights caught his attention, and he looked to the right. A display flashed across the door of a nearby building, so he walked over to it, curious. The top of the display said, "News," and text was slowly scrolling downward, so he started to read. After last night's flurry, 6 million more Caucasians have succumbed to the effects of the artificial virus COVID-89. That brings the grand total to 1.3 billion deaths. Experts estimate that by July, there will be less than 0.001% of the white population left on the planet. Since people of color are immune to the fatal portions of the virus, black business is booming. Many governmental bodies have resorted to holding underground meetings, creating uproar amongst most of the citizens who believe they are being unjustly controlled by a government that was in on the scandal. Because people of color are all carriers of the virus, the government continually enforces a strict shelter-at-home policy for all white Americans, but many are questioning if that is enough. Delante swallowed his spit wrong after reading this and started coughing. He tapped his chest a few times before recovering. "This has got to be a joke," Delante said to himself, startling a person donned in all white that meandered out of the building. Maybe he had read something wrong. His eyes scanned the article again. What was COVID-89? Wasn't there just COVID-19? Of course, the government was always testing something. He wouldn't be surprised if something else had been released. These other phrases didn't make sense. Black business booming? Shelter at home for all white Americans? A rock settled into the pit of Delante's stomach. This was why he didn't watch the news. This had to be something fake. Someone hacked something. But then he frowned. He was black. But what if the news was lying and everyone was affected instead of just white people? That would make more sense. He thought of his adopted parents and started to wonder if they were even still alive. Delante stopped reading and took a few steps back. He felt lightheaded. The news of such a deadly virus sounded less than appealing. He started to question where he would go and what he would do. Was he even still in the same state as before, or had the time machine sent him somewhere else? He instantly thought back to the cops and winced at the thought of all the kids from his neighborhood getting arrested. From a distance, the old man watched Delante. He licked his chapped lips as he thought about the years of his life that he had spent waiting for this precise moment. All of the planning, all of the disappointment, it was all going to be worth it. But he had to be smart. Cooper's image was burned into his brain. For years, he had worked on the research and development team under Cooper's leadership. He was an anomaly, one of the few blacks alive during his time. All had died off or were killed off, and those left were either rich or working hard to be relevant in a white world. So remain relevant he did. He became one of the smartest workers in the company, and Cooper had praised him like a son and prodigy. All of the accolades meant nothing when he had made a breakthrough on something he had been working on for so long and brought it to Cooper. It was a new development on a theory which would explain time manipulation. "This is going to be your moment," Cooper told him. "You are going to be a very celebrated man. I want you to forward what you've been working on to me, and tomorrow we will write up something to get this out there." That never happened. Instead, he had walked into work the next day to find out that Cooper had claimed the work for his own, and instead of celebration, he was getting fired. As he walked out of the doors, he swore his revenge. For a long time, no one saw him. Kids and neighborhood residents had named the reclusive shell of a man Old Shack. Part of that was because his home, which had once been nice-looking, now looked like an old shack. You could ask anyone and get 1,000 stories about the man. He had died and become a ghost. He was creating a monster robot. He had missing kids tied up in the basement. But the truth was that Old Shack was trying to rewrite his history. He took the theory he had been working on that was stolen and began to develop it. For years, he stayed secluded until he successfully built it. A time machine. But not just a time machine. This one also slid in and out of alternate universes. A new energy filled his heart, and he began to travel back to different points in time, trying to erase the genocide, the diseases, the killing off of his people. It was all in vain. Old Shack didn't give up, though. He knew there had to be a way to change it all. Maybe that way was not in the past, but in alternate Earths. A world like his world, but not his world. Then he found it, an anomaly like he was. It was a world where a tech billionaire funded a bioengineered compound that courses back infertility in the guise of a vaccine. But the compound mutated into a highly contagious disease that produces a temporary fever and rash in black people. But the white population, it caused organ failure and eventual death. By the time the disease was discovered, it had killed millions and infected billions of whites. The rich whites literally went underground, sealing themselves away to avoid contagion. When Old Shack observed that the rich whites were getting closer to developing an effective cure, he decided to step in. Old Shack figured in order to get rid of the rich whites for good, he would have to introduce the virus much earlier. Right now, he was staring at the one who would introduce the virus in a special way. Delante was still in a daze when he heard something echo in the air. "Hey, boy." Delante looked in between two buildings. Under the display there sat an old man on a black plastic box, holding a black walking stick with slightly worn black clothing. He had nappy white hair underneath a black hat and a wrinkled face, but his eyes were bright and looking straight at Delante. He warily stared at the man, who gave him a wide grin. "Hey, boy, come here. Come on now, I won't hurt you," the old man said as he beckoned with a shaky right arm. The man didn't appear to be any kind of threat to anyone, so Delante thought it would be safe to approach him. Still, he did so cautiously, recognizing that this man was different than anyone else he had recently come across. He was muttering to himself under his breath as Delante came within a few feet of him. "Well now, where'd you get them clothes from? You look like a picture of my father when he was a boy. Those kicks look brand new. They must have cost a fortune to fabricate." Delante wasn't sure what the man meant, but assumed he was getting a compliment. Thanks, I guess." He didn't move any closer. The old man chewed on an invisible item. His mouth worked overtime as he stared at the shoes and then shook his head really quick, as if willing himself back to the present conversation. "You look like you're lost, boy. Where you headed?" "I'm not sure, old man." "Don't call me old man." Delante jumped back at a sudden outburst that came through a snarl. The man changed his facial expression quickly back to the smile. "I mean, the name is Shaq. Folks around here call me Old Shaq. I'm not old, though. Not old." Delante nodded slowly, but stayed where he was. There was definitely something off with this guy, and he wasn't sure he wanted to come into contact with him or the cane in his hand, which looked sturdy enough to hurt if he got whacked by it. Old Shaq chuckled softly. "It's okay. You're not lost. I know why you're here," he said softly. "You do?" Delante's voice cracked. "I've been waiting on you." Old Shaq looked around. "Not just you. You here alone? You ain't come with someone else?" "No," Delante said. "It's just me. I kind of came here by accident." "No accident. They told me you wouldn't come, but you're here." "Who told you?" Old Shaq pointed to his head and smiled before clearing his throat. "So, tell me about you. You, how's your girlfriend? She's a good one, huh? Got you on your toes?" Delante wasn't sure how the man knew he had a girlfriend. Part of him wanted to get away, but the other part was curious. "What do you know about my girlfriend?" Old Shaq shrugged. "Old Shaq know a lot about a lot." He pointed to his head again, and then cleared his throat as he leaned forward in a serious manner. "And your parents? Are they okay?" "What?" Delante understood what the man was saying. He just couldn't believe it. "What?" the old man mimicked in a high-pitched voice, causing him to cough. "Did I use too many big words for you? You don't think this is serious?" Delante shuddered again as the old man yelled, puffing out his chest. Then, just as quickly, he shrunk back. "This is a serious matter, because if we don't act, they're going to try something again. But if we do act, there's going to be pain, even for us." "For us?" Delante bit his lip, but old Shaq sat up straight. "You smell that?" Delante shook his head as the old man sniffed the air. "That's the smell of desperateness." Old Shaq returned to a smile. Delante shook his head. "Listen, it's been great talking to you, but I really don't want to get involved with whatever this is. Freedom for our people and death to all who disagree." Delante raised an eyebrow. The old man was now singing. "We don't fight, we will die. We all must fight for black lives." "I don't know what you're talking about, Old Shaq." "Is you black?" Old Shaq asked. Delante nodded. "Then you know. If you know, then you're obligated. You just said you was black, so now you're obligated." Delante looked around at his surroundings. Something was definitely different, but what the old man was saying sounded familiar. It sounded like something he would say, something that he told Julie. "Listen, I think I get it. We have to fight for Black," Delante said. "But right now, I need to find my family and friends. I need to know what's going on." Old Shaq dropped his head. His shoulders started to shake as if he was crying. "You don't understand. You don't know what's going to happen. If you don't, then..." The old man began to cry harder. He knew what was going to happen, even if the kid didn't. Delante groaned and started to reach out to comfort the old man when he saw something swing at him out of the corner of his eye. It was too late to duck, as the walking stick smacked his head hard, and everything went dark. Old Shaq looked at the limp boy with tears still in his eyes. He hated to do it, but he knew it had to be done. "Sorry, boy. I'm so sorry. I gotta do this." He leaned over slowly and patted Delante down until he found the boy's phone. "You'll understand soon. You'll understand why it's you." Beep, beep, beep. Delante blinked a few times and woke up with a start. He realized he was in a hospital bed, and the heart rate monitor provided the beeping background chorus. He sighed and rubbed his head, noticing it was bandaged. A headache pushed to the forefront of his skull, and he studied his surroundings. He appeared to be in a normal wing of the hospital, but all of the staff appeared frantic. He swung his legs out over the bed and put them on the floor just as a nurse walked in. "Whoa there, slow down, cowboy," the nurse said with a polite smile. She made a tick on the chart she clutched and held out a hand, motioning for him to get back in the bed. He complied, but continued to sit up. He rubbed his forearm and realized it was tender, as if someone had pricked him with a needle recently. "Where am I, Doc?" Delante said as the nurse focused her attention on the chart. "Wait, that can't be right," she said to herself, flipping a few of the pages back and forth. "Doc?" "Oh, sorry," the nurse said, looking up and flashing another smile. "My name is Jenny. I'm not really a doctor. Well, I'm not a medical doctor. I have a doctorate, so I guess I'm technically a doctor, but I'm actually a research assistant under Dr. Bochi Ajay." "Okay, but where am I? Last thing I remember, I was talking to an old man." More nurses rushed by, wielding empty gurneys and yelling something about more Krispies. "Oh, right. Sorry, I'm not used to actually speaking with patients. They just asked me to do your blood work because they were all tied up due to the fire." Delante flashed her an annoyed look, and she lifted her eyebrows, nodding apologetically. "Sorry, I guess I'm just a little thrown off by the results of your blood work. You're in St. Abbott's down on Main Street. You were lucky. It's a 5-minute walk from where you were attacked." "Attacked? By what?" Jenny was cute. She had a pretty light complexion, but he could tell she was either mixed or light-skinned. "According to the notes, the city found you in an alleyway, unconscious, with a bump on your head. Surveillance shows you were attacked by Old Shaq. He's well known around here. He's always trying to recruit folks to his revolution. Because you didn't have any registered clothing on and you didn't have any valid identification, you were all but invisible to the medics that were called. My contacts were even having a hard time picking you up, so I had to take them out." She studied the charts again. "Must be why I'm getting this reading." "Reading?" "Yeah, sorry. We run blood work on all vagrants to make sure they don't have any infectious diseases that the nursing staff would need to know about. Then we transport them to City B. Even though it's new, COVID-89 is one of the diseases we test for, even though pretty much everyone has it. But your blood came back negative. Somehow your body has never been exposed." Delante questioned if he should say anything about his time-traveling origins, but her use of the term vagrant made him think she would assume he was crazy. So he kept the thoughts to himself and let her continue. "Well, in the off chance this reading is right, you might be a means to create a vaccine for this crazy virus. Give me a sec to run this past Dr. Bochi Ajay." Jenny turned and half closed the curtain around his bed. He was in a room just outside of another room. that had a sign that said lab in front of it, and Jenny walked into that room. He could still see her lab coat as she stopped just inside the door. His heart picked up pace as he thought of becoming a guinea pig. He swung his legs out of bed and crept over to the wall beside the lab. He stayed out of sight, but could overhear Jenny speaking to someone on the phone. "Yes, I have the sample right here in the fridge." No, he has not exhibited any of the carrier symptoms. No rash on the palms and no fever. "Okay, I won't do anything until you arrive." Understood. I'll go find an anesthesiologist and prep him for surgery. And in the meantime, I'll have someone lock this whole wing down to prevent the contagion spreading to him. Jenny hung up the phone, and Delante's heart pounded its way into his throat again. He looked around for something to hit Jenny with if she stepped back out and attempted to sedate him, but instead he heard her walking further into the room. He peeked around the corner and saw her open a fridge, pick up a blood sample, shake it, and put it back before exiting through a back door. Delante's heart remained a rampaging rhinoceros in his chest, and he tried to look normal as another team of nurses pushing a gurney ran by. He ducked into the lab when they passed and jogged over to the fridge. He opened it and pulled out his blood, examining it as if he could tell it was his blood just by looking instead of reading the label. The label confirmed it was his, but still, in the lab gown, he had no pockets, so he concealed it in his hand as best he could. Upon exiting the room, another team of nurses rolled a gurney the opposite direction, and this time a man with severe burns wheezed atop it. Delante cringed, and for some reason envisioned himself turning into that man if he stayed in the hospital. Moving as quickly as he could, Delante went down the hall in the direction the nurses had taken the empty gurneys. He avoided eye contact with the receptionist as he passed, and he felt that if his heart beat any faster, it would explode. "Excuse me, sir, do you need to check out?" the receptionist said. "No, ma'am, just going out for some fresh air. I'll be right back." "Stop him!" came a voice from down the hall. Delante broke into a run and made it through the door. He looked around and realized he was in an empty parking lot. Instead of cars, there were rows and rows of motorized scooters that had levitating gurneys hooked to the back. He saw 2 EMTs hop onto separate scooters and speed off, likely responding to an emergency call. "There! Stop him!" This time, Delante turned and saw Jenny with 2 security officers in tow. They each held clear batons that were made of plastic or glass. They were donned in the usual white, and each blew a whistle as they sprinted towards him. He ran toward the nearest scooter, gritting his teeth from the pain of his bare feet scraping against the cement ground. Making it to the scooter, he hopped on and looked for a key or an on switch. Instead, it instantly powered on, and he gripped the handlebars and twisted them forward. The scooter exploded out from its parking spot and started beeping. A heads-up display popped up above the handlebars, and a flashing red light appeared. Without command, his scooter started heading toward the red light. But he turned, and the bars allowed him to divert. Off the preset course, the HUD turned red and started flashing, but he ignored it, checking over his shoulder. His pursuers had also snagged scooters and zipped after him. He hung a left and looked to the sky to try to determine where he was. He thought back and failed to remember a hospital or anything similar to the Red Cross displayed prominently above the building, so he assumed it had been further down the walkway and out of his field of vision. Using the other buildings he did recognize as a guide, he turned down the walkway and tried to make his body as aerodynamic as possible. He turned over his shoulder again to see whether the guards were gaining on him. He sighed a little in relief as he saw that they were still a good distance behind him, but when he brought his attention back to the front, a dispatching rail commuter hopped down in front of him. He swerved to the right and nearly tipped over, but managed to stay upright. The sound of a crash pulled his attention to the rear again, and he saw one of the officers go down hard. The gurney broke free and flipped end over end before skidding to a stop and scattering glass or plastic everywhere. The remaining guard continued to whistle and yell at him, but Delante continued on, wishing he knew how to make his vehicle move faster. His spirits rose as he recognized his entry point into the city. He exited through it and sped off in the direction of the field where the machine was. The security guard remained in pursuit. They closed the distance to the field in a matter of minutes, and he jumped off when he arrived. The machine was still invisible, but he found it by looking for depressions in the flower bed. He tried to find the door panel, but failed. The guard was fast approaching, so he hopped over the vehicle and decided to make a run for it on foot. The sound of another crash reached his ears, and he ripped around just in time to dodge the disconnected gurney as it flipped end over end a few times before skidding to a halt in the dirt. The scooter was cracked in half, and the guard was thrown free. He was face down a few feet away from Delante, and Delante walked up to him. He took the clear baton away before poking the guard with it a few times. The rise and fall of the guard's back told Delante the guard was alive, and despite the guard's intent to capture him, knowing the guy hadn't died provided some relief. Even though he'd only gone a short distance on foot, Delante was breathing deep. He went to the machine and braced himself against it, and like before, his touch activated the camouflage until he could fully see the vehicle. He found the handle and popped it open. Before going inside, he fought the strong urge to scratch his hand. He glared at his palm. It was covered with red flecks, and he instantly thought of what the nurse had said about him being asymptomatic. He took a deep breath and leaned his back against the time machine, staring at his hands. If he was showing symptoms, that would mean he had contracted the virus. If he went back in time now, there was a strong possibility he would initiate an epidemic. But if he stayed in this time, he would likely become a guinea pig that suffered and eventually died in the name of saving white people. The last thing he wanted to do was make a rash decision. He had managed to hold onto the vial of his blood, and he glared at it. His reflection stared back at him, and he gritted his teeth, unsure of what to do next. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of COVID-98 Part 1, written by Kofi Ose-Uwosu and narrated by Joyce Licorice. Literary copyright by NEO-AFRO Publishing. Production copyright by NEO-AFRO Production. All rights reserved. The end.